Hi, we're here today to do a case study on 1918 Cadillacs. We have with us here two 1918 Cadillacs. This Cadillac here is an American 1918 Cadillac. We actually pulled this out of a shed after 39 years of storage. It's an absolute cracker of a car as far as originality and condition. And we have this car here that we've owned for many decades. This car was bodied in Australia. It actually left the factory on the 14th of February 1918, bound for Sydney, Australia. So I've been asked a lot of questions over the differences between the two cars. This is the first opportunity I've ever had to park two cars together. The first difference, and it's the one I'm always asked about, is the bright work on this car. And the early photos always show bright work on the radiator surround and on the headlights, and for that matter on the windscreen. If we look at this car here, we'll see this has got black headlights surrounds, black head radiator and black windscreen. So that's a difference. You have to bear in mind that lots of 1918 Cadillacs were sent out of America for the war effort, and they were reasonably plain Jane cars. But the early photographic evidence of this car always show that in Australia it wore bright work. So if you look at them mechanically, they're identical, albeit that this was originally right-hand drive, this was originally left-hand drive. That's the way it was ordered, that's the way it was sent to Sydney in 1918. Now, if you'd asked me 2 decades ago, I would have told you these guards, these fenders, were very exclusively Australian designed, as I would have told you the bonnet was the same, or the hood as the Americans would call it. And yet when you stand these cars side by side and line them up, you will see that these guards and these guards are virtually identical, to the point where if you come back to here, to the ends of the guards and the starts of the running boards, you will see they're at identical length. So it's my opinion that even though it was sent out as chassis only, it was accompanied by a radiator with a shroud that was later nickeled, or nickeled it when it was built. American guards, the same as these, an American hood or bonnet. Where you start to get into differences is here, from the firewall backwards. If you look at this cowl, this is very different shape to this. This has got a nice flat curve where this is sharp and comes up. If you start and look at the windscreen, and if you stand back 20 feet, you would say to yourself, these windscreens are the same. But I can tell you, if you measure them, this windscreen is 3 inches wider than this windscreen. So they're very different. Once you get a bit further back, you'll see that both doors overlap the cowl. There, flat across the top. This has got allocations for side curtains there. This butts up here. These doors actually have a slope backwards, which gave an impression of speed back then, despite the fact that there was really not much glamour about them at the time. But then you get into this. This is the back of the front seat. This panel here, you'll see that it's this wide, whereas this panel is only this wide. This is about 10 inches, this is about 15. And you'll notice the slope back up. It's very reminiscent of having a dual cowl phaeton, and you can see that this car is fitted with a second windscreen. Both these cars are 7 passengers, so both cars have jump seats. But then you get into the treatment of the doors at the back. So you look at this and you look at these hidden hinges in here, whereas these are exposed hinges, and then you come to there. Now if you look at the valance, both valances are the same. We've measured them, we've looked at them. This shape is the same. The battery box lid is virtually the same on both sides. So we've got lots of similarities. I would suggest to you that these came from the factory in America and with the car. But once you get to the rear fenders or the rear guards, then you start and see some differences. If you look at these come straight up, these lay back, you've got a very similar swage, and you're starting to look at the shape. And if we bring the camera around the back, there you'll see a lot of really strong differences. These fenders swoop out, but these ones are longer, deeper. The sweep is not so bad, so harsh. And if you look at it, it's set well away from the springs. If you look at the difference there, the inside of the gap between the spring and the fender, and the inside of the gap between the spring and the fender, major differences. So the rear fenders are obviously Australian fenders, and if you stand back and look at the tub, this is where you see major differences in it. Even though they're both 7-passenger cars, and you know, you could nearly have a party in the back of them with the amount of room that's in there. If you look at this, particularly if you take the luggage, the spare tyre rack, the dual spare tyre rack, as a reference point, you take from the back of there to there is probably 10 or 11 inches. If you come to the Australian bodied one and you look there, we've got about 5. And if you look at the two different spare tyre racks, despite the fact they're both dual carriers as this one wears, they are very, very different. And the reason for that is because if you take this carrier off here and put it on here, you actually can't get a second wheel on there. It actually hits against the tub because of the fact this tub sits at a good 5 or 6 inches further back than the American version of that. So if you look at the cars, mechanically identical, exactly the same. Left-hand drive, right-hand drive, that's a matter of changing the clutch pedal around on the gearbox. And yes, the gearbox is exclusively, the caster gearbox casting is exclusively right-hand drive or exclusively left-hand drive. They're not interchangeable, but everything else mechanically is pretty well the same. If we get up front to the dash here, again, you'll see that this is very, very different. If you have a look in the dash in here, the gauges are all the same, except for the speedo, which is slightly different. They're both Stewart speedos, but they're slightly different. The gauge is the same, but the layout is not. The dash is not. This is actually wood underneath here, whereas on this one, you'll see the rolled piece of wood, and you've got the vent. This car does not have the vent, right? And I can tell you from experience, having restored this car, if you get into the woodwork under the dash and everything, Bill was on that side of the car and Joe was on this side of the cars, because the wood up underneath the dash, whilst it's supposed to be symmetric, doesn't actually look anything like symmetric. But regardless, the car looks symmetric when you stand back. And that was simply the labour shortages and the labour people they had at the time. One person would be working on one side of the car, one person would be working on this side of the car. So as I mentioned, we've had this car for a very long time. We've toured it considerably, extensively. It's an absolute cracker of a car. This car here equally would work out it fully restored as an absolute cracker of a car as well. This is, as I said at the beginning, a case study on the differences between a very Australian bodied car. This car was bodied by EEA Gate in Summerhill in Sydney, and has never been owned outside of New South Wales, Australia. This car was found in a shed in San Diego, California, and it had sat there for 39 years that we know of. So cracker of a car, very good case study to have a look at the differences.